Got an adventure to prep but need some ideas? Today I'm going to walk you through a simple 4-step process to take any cool D&D map you already own and turn it into a memorable adventure you can run tomorrow night. As you can see, I have a large collection of physical maps and even more digital maps. I use this map first method for inspiration all the time. With so many cool pre-made maps out there, you don't need to be a great artist to use an impressive map to hook your players into an engaging adventure. Let's get started.
Cool Nerd Mark.
If you have a map ready, you can skip to step 1. But if you don't already have a map in mind, you need to start with step 0, pick a map. I try to look for maps that have some details I can use. Furniture, interesting terrain, rooms that look like someone lives or has lived there. With a little thought and the right questions, you can unlock the story that's hiding in plain sight on the map. If you don't know where to find physical or digital battle maps, I'll list a few of my favorite sources in the comments. Once you choose a map, a good place to start is by asking, why does this place exist? Honestly, this is a question I almost never asked when I was a young dungeon master, drawing maps like this on whatever graph paper I could find. And yes, if you look closely, it says breakdancing vampire. I was 12 and it was the 80s. But later on, I realized that if a dungeon, castle, temple, or mine exists, somebody had to build it, and they probably had a reason for doing so. And over the decades or centuries since then, the place may have changed hands multiple times. The map itself can often give you clues. I needed a dwarven mine for a recent adventure, so I grabbed this map from Czepeku. When I looked at it closely, my first thought was, what were the dwarves mining here? And why did they stop if there's clearly still gold ore in the walls? This map has tools abandoned on the ground, overturned mine carts, broken tracks, cave-ins, skeletons everywhere, and a giant hole in the floor. To me, that suggests some kind of invasion or disaster. The dwarves either died here or fled, and whoever took over afterwards never continued the mining operation. In the lore of the Nova Glen region where I set the adventure, these lands were once part of a dwarven kingdom that still exists north of the mountains. A few hundred years ago, the region was invaded by giants who pushed the dwarves back across the mountains and ruled this area for about a century afterwards. Now, giants themselves really can't operate effectively inside a crowded mine, so I decided they allied themselves with a smaller species to occupy it. I went with kobolds, partly because I hadn't really decided what role kobolds played in my setting. And honestly, maybe I was also subconsciously thinking about that mine level in Baldur's Gate where everything is full of kobolds. But you can do this with almost any map. Once you understand why a place exists, you can start building a simple history around it. And notice I said simple. You do not need to write 10 pages of lore your players are never going to read. Just jot down a few notes about who built the place, what happened there, and why it changed over time. Then when we get to step 4, it becomes much easier to fill the dungeon with monsters, clues, treasures, and environmental details that all feel connected to the same story. Now that you've established who built the place, it's time to think about the current residents. Or in other words, if the dungeon became vacant, what kind of creatures would consider moving in? If those creatures need food, water, metal, magical energy, or something even stranger, does this dungeon provide a reliable source of it? I like to start with the boss monster. Who's in charge of the place? Because that decision affects almost every other creature in the dungeon. Look at the biggest or most interesting room in the map. Which room feels like the setting for your finale? And what kind of creature would live there? The map itself can give clues. If the final room is full of coffins and sarcophagi, that points you in one direction. If it's a giant mushroom cave, that suggests something very different. At this stage, I'm usually not looking for an exact monster yet, only a monster type. So in the first example, I might write down undead, and in the second, maybe plant creatures or fungal monsters. Then I either grab a monster book and start flipping through it, or I use an advanced monster search online. Most RPG systems have searchable monster databases where you can filter by monster type, level, or challenge rating, terrain, alignment, and other details. I especially like the ones that let me filter by sourcebook so I can narrow things down to books I actually own. I'll link a few for some different systems in the video description. Once I've chosen a boss monster, I start making a list of other creatures that might live in the dungeon. Usually I want them to be a little weaker than the boss encounter, since they're building towards the climax, not replacing it. It's good to come up with more secondary monster ideas than you actually need, so you have a pool of creatures for stocking your dungeon. At this stage, don't worry about exactly where they go on the map yet. We'll get to that in step 4. Think about how these creatures interact with each other and with the boss. Are they loyal minions, worshippers, mercenaries, or are they just neighbors trying to survive in the same dangerous place? Personally, I think it's interesting when the creatures live alongside the main villain without fully working for them. That gives the players some more options. Maybe the PCs fight them, but maybe they negotiate and form an alliance. Maybe the neighbor monster isn't willing to directly fight your vampire lord, but they might provide information or resources for the right price. And finally, think about motivations. Most villains have bigger ambitions than sitting in a dungeon waiting for the heroes to show up and steal their loot. For simple monsters, that may just be to survive and reproduce. More intelligent villains have long-term plans, political ambitions, magical experiments, or elaborate schemes they would really prefer the heroes stop meddling with.
And it would have been mine if it hadn't been for those meddling kids.
It's also worth the time to jot down a note or two on what the other creatures in the dungeon want. It creates a more layered and interesting dynamic if the other creatures have their own goals beyond blindly and fanatically serving the villain. Now that you've established a reason for the place and what lives there, it's time to think about why the players want to go to your dungeon in the first place. And while the most obvious treasure is gold, gems, and magic items, treasure can really be anything valuable that the players have to work and fight to obtain. If the villain is holding prisoners, then rescuing those prisoners is the treasure. If the villain has created a magical orb that controls the weather, then smashing that orb is the treasure. If the villain has made their lair inside a sacred dwarven temple, then the dwarves might hire the PCs to evict them. The treasure could even be the villain themselves if there's a bounty for their capture, dead or alive. So while treasure can absolutely be loot, it can also be people, resources, information, or simply the elimination of a threat. Once you know what the treasure is, think about where it's located. You can, of course, just put the main treasure in the boss fight room. You can also hide it in a secret chamber nearby, protected by a puzzle, trap, or some other obstacle. And once in a while, the PCs might discover that the treasure isn't actually in this dungeon at all, and defeating the villain only gives them a clue that leads to the next adventure. Sorry, but your princess is in another castle. In addition to the main treasure, be sure to place a few smaller treasures throughout the dungeon as rewards for defeating monsters, solving puzzles, avoiding traps, or just because your PCs need a little encouragement. Especially at lower levels, it's worth to consider consumable magic items that can help the players to survive or fight the villain more effectively. Potions of healing, holy water against undead, or alchemist fire if they're fighting frost giants, things like that. This is also a great opportunity to place treasures that the current occupants may have overlooked that were left behind by the previous owners. If you've ever lived in an apartment or rental house and found treasures that the previous tenants forgot to take with them, you already know exactly what I mean. Now that you have a broad overview of what's in your dungeon, it's time to go room by room and place your monsters, treasures, and challenges. The 1984 Dungeon Master's Rulebook from the D&D Basics set had a very simple D6 table for stocking dungeons. For each room, besides your finale room, you rolled a D6. If you rolled a 1 to 2, the room was empty. 3 was a trap, 4 to 5 was a monster, and 6 was special. This created dungeons with some good variety, but also dungeons where a third of the rooms were empty. Now, I'm not opposed to rooms without monsters, traps, or treasure, but I don't think a third of your rooms in most dungeons should be completely empty, unless the current occupants are literally in the process of moving out. And honestly, empty rooms are a great opportunity to tell the story of what used to be there before the room became empty. This is where the lore and world building aspects can really shine. It's also a great place to hide clues, supplies, or overlooked treasures that PCs can discover if they don't immediately write off the room as nothing there. And empty rooms are suspicious. If the players walk into a completely clean room with a shiny red button mounted over a plaque that says, "Whatever you do, don't push this button," then the TPK that happens next is honestly not your fault. Does that sound a little too specific? Now, while you absolutely can use a random stocking table, personally, I prefer to read the room. And I mean that literally. I look at the room on the map and ask myself, what would be logical to put here? If there's a river to cross, maybe the bridge is trapped. If there's a ledge overlooking a cave passage, maybe it's the perfect place for giant frogs to grab PCs with their sticky tongues and drag them up to be swallowed whole. Use the map itself as inspiration. Even though I don't really use random dungeon stocking tables anymore, I still try to keep the types of encounters somewhat proportional so the pacing of the dungeon doesn't get stale. Now, this can vary depending on the kind of story I'm trying to tell, but a decent starting point is 50% some kind of creature encounter, 30% non-combat challenge, 10% treasure or resources, and 10% something weird. For the rest of this video, I'm going to apply this process to a map that I found in Elven Cartography's free Creative Commons map collection. Check the description for a link. I started by printing this map and making some notes on paper. Then I made the process digital so it would be easier to show you. Let's go. The map I chose is called Cultist Hideout. Let's go through the process to turn it into an adventure. Step 1. Why does this place exist? I have a city in my world called Leshmira. It's a capital city, and underneath the Capitol Hill is a network of tunnels that's currently used by a crime network as a black market and secret hideout. Long ago, Leshmira was run by an evil, repressive government, and these tunnels were home of the underground resistance. Among the resistance was a temple to Zorobel, the bringer of light. When the resistance triumphed and the evil government was overthrown, this temple was abandoned and a new one was built in the sunlight. Recently, the ruins of the temple were discovered by a cult of Juiblex, demon lord of oozes. They used the front of it as a black market alchemist shop, and the caves in the back to turn willing cultists into intelligent oozes, using a staff that polymorphs people into oozes, but allows them to keep their memories so they can savor the experience. Step 2. Who lives there? Rather than a single boss, I want the cult to be run by a power couple, a tiefling artificer with the alchemist subclass, and a human demon cultist cleric. Then I'll stock the dungeon with cultists who have been turned into various oozes, and throw in a carrion crawler who's just a neighbor. Step 3. The party's been hired by the Temple of Zorobel. The high priestess had a vision that something horrible was happening to a historic temple, and is paying the PCs to check it out and possibly restore the temple as a historical site, or at least bring back a lost relic, a holy candle holder. Step 4. What's in each room? Okay, so I'll have an alchemy shop up front, and it will be run by a few cultists who have not yet proven themselves worthy enough to have the honor of getting turned into oozes. I think this is likely to be a role-playing encounter, but in case there is a fight, I can use the cultist stat block in the basic rules, which will be a pretty easy fight. I'll have a small alchemy lab next to that, mostly for making quick items or identifying anything that's brought in to sell or trade. There can be a few alchemical items that the PCs might find useful in the fight later. South of that, I'll include a storage room where the cultists put statues, altar cloths, robes, and other items that once belonged to the original temple. Nothing really of value on the open market, but valuable for the church for their historical and religious significance. The next room is a cave that will seem empty, but is actually filled with an almost invisible gelatinous cube, our first enlightened cultist. The next chamber is our big boss fight room. I decided it should be in the middle rather than at the end of the adventure because that's just how the map is laid out. I put a few gray oozes to guard the door because our power couple is busy working on their plan to make everybody one with the great ooze. A river runs through the cave and forms a pool before continuing north through a submerged passage. The PCs must swim through this passage to get to the secret relic room where the holy candlestick and a bunch of loot is. Loot that technically belongs to the church, but it's a gray area. East of the main chamber is a kitchen where a cultist who loved to cook is now an ochre jelly who is making some disgusting fish and mushroom stew. And beyond that is the cultist sleeping quarters. That is where the cultists will keep their treasure, which is absolutely okay to loot. And finally to the northeast is the cultist neighbor, an ordinary carrion crawler. Or maybe he's a former priest of Zoravel who got turned into a carrion crawler. I'll have to think about that one. And there you go, from map to dungeon in 4 steps. Maybe I'll run this one soon. It sounds like fun. If you like this video, please check out my adventures and supplements from my gaming world at coolnerdmark.com/adventures for some low cost and free content. You can also find my stuff at DriveThruRPG. If you like gaming-related and geek-friendly music, check out my music on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and other streaming services. I also have MP3s for download and CDs for order at coolnerdmark.com. If you're in the Seattle-Tacoma area, I have a few shows coming up, and I'll be announcing more soon. You can check out my website for concert dates and sign up to get alerts for upcoming shows. And keep cool, nerds. Thanks to Sketchbubble for providing the free slide template that I used for making this video.
Monster cereals, yeah, yeah.